I'd also ask the chair to advise me when I've consumed 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Well, I thank the leader, the majority leader and the minority leader both for their comments on this report. It's important for the American people to know this is the first of 3 reports we're going to receive. This report just covers what the GAO has looked at in the last 4 to 5 years. It truly only covers about 1/3 of the federal government. And I'm talking discretionary programs, not mandatory programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And in here is at least $100 billion in savings if we would do our job. And we're going to have a large debate over the next 2 weeks of funding the government for the next 6 months of this fiscal year and what the funding is going to be like in the next year. If I was sitting at home, a regular American looking at us and having read this report, the question I'd ask is, why is there going to be any debate at all? The GAO has given us a roadmap. They've said, here's where $100 billion, those are my numbers, not theirs, of savings that can come on an annualized basis on the first third of the discretionary side of the federal government. The discretionary programs of this government are 24% greater now than they were 2 years ago. And what the challenge that we face before us as a nation is a far greater challenge than anything we've ever faced. And that sounds like a gigantic overstatement. But when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is head of all our military, reporting to our civilian officials, says the greatest threat to this country is our debt, we ought to wake up and pay attention to it. When the average American, 75% of the Americans across this land, want the size of the federal government and its spending reduced. That's Democrats, Republicans, and independents. What is lacking today is the leadership to define the problem for the American people so that we can come together as a nation and solve this greatest of all challenges before us. And let me spend a minute talking about what's going to happen if we don't solve it. You heard the minority leader, the senator from Kentucky, talk about the $1.65 trillion deficit this year. Today, the United States is borrowing money on average across everything that they borrowed for about 2%. The historical average at which we borrow money is around 6%. We're going to add over the next 2 years, if we don't change things drastically, and I'm talking drastically, we're going to add another $3.5 trillion to the debt to bring us to almost $18 trillion worth of debt. Well, if you apply our historical interest rates to the debt, which we will be at in 2 or 3 years, there's no question about that, of 6% to $18 trillion, what you get is $1.08 trillion a year in interest costs. Now think about that. We spent $127 billion this last year on interest. And we're going to take $1 trillion. What happens if that happens? What that means is there's no discretionary budget. That means there's no money for the military, there's no money for education, there's no money for all the programs other than Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That's the only thing that's left. And if that happens, our ability to borrow money in the international market will markedly decline. And the likelihood is that interest rates will go even higher than our historical average of 6%. So the time to call us together, the time for shared sacrifice, not for sacrifice's sake, but so we can restore a hope of prosperity for our nation, is now. It's not tomorrow, it's now. We're going to have a small bill on the floor that over the next 2 weeks will eliminate $4 billion by advancing terminations of programs that both President Bush and President Obama want to terminate, and eliminate $2.7 billion worth of earmarks that are inappropriate. $4 billion over 2 weeks. Our interest cost today and what we're borrowing is $3 billion a day was what we're borrowing that we don't have. Every day we go into the markets and borrow $3 billion. So over these 2 weeks, 14 days, we're going to borrow $42 billion. And we're only going to save $4 billion. You see the magnitude of the problem? We cannot continue to go in the direction we're going. And so the bill that the House sent us is a step in the right direction, but far less than what is needed based on the reality of what is in front of us. Every dollar this government spends, we borrow 40 cents of it. 40 cents. What do you think, as a 20-year-old individual out there, is going to see 20 years from now as a consequence of us going down the drain in terms of the interest costs and the debt? Necessity is the mother of invention. We have a need now as a nation, not as Republicans, Democrats, or Independents, as a nation to come together and make the decisions that will put us on a course that guarantees a future for our kids and our grandkids. And the easiest way I know right now to take some of the sting out of the parochialism and the partisanship is for every member of this body in the House to become acutely aware of what this report says. The minority leader listed a few of the programs, but let me go through. Just sitting at home or sitting in your office, think about if any of this makes sense. 82 separate teacher training programs run by the federal government. 82? 82 separate sets of bureaucracies, sets of federal employees. None of these teacher programs, by the way, training programs, have a metric on them to evaluate whether or not they're successful. So when we're not successful, and I would question whether it's even a role for the federal government to be involved in teacher training. I can't find it in the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson couldn't find it in the Constitution. Roosevelt couldn't find it in the Constitution. Johnson couldn't find it in the Constitution. They all said so. We have quotes that state that. And yet we have 82 programs, none of which we know whether or not they're working. We have 47 job training programs, 44 of which overlap one another, some to the degree of 100%, some to the degree of 60%. We spend $18 billion a year on it, and not one of them has a measurement on whether or not it's effective. We have a great need in our country today to retrain people to available jobs. Yet we don't have any idea whether these are working. And if you go out and try to figure out how to get through these programs, you need another government program to help you figure out how to get through them. We have 20 offices with programs for homeless people. 20 different programs. At the federal level, again, if you read the Constitution and the enumerated powers, you find real difficulty in saying whether or not that's a federal responsibility versus a state. But yet we have 20 different separate programs for homeless people. How about one that works if in fact it's a responsibility of the federal government? We run 80 separate economic development programs, 80 of them. There's 80 different federal programs in 4 different cabinet agencies. We spend $6.5 billion a year, and what the GAO says is you can't say whether or not there's any economic development that's come out of the $6.5 billion. The Department of Transportation spends $58 billion on 100 separate programs run by 5 different agencies with 6,000 employees, with no idea whether that's the most efficient or effective way to do it, because nobody's ever put a metric on it. We have 30 separate food programs on food safety run by 15 different federal agencies. And we just added a whole bunch more with the last food safety bill, none of which consolidated anything, none of which had a metric on it, none of which perfected the idea. Food safety in terms of interstate transport is undoubtedly a federal responsibility. But how about an efficient and effective way to do that? How about one agency in the federal government that's responsible for food safety instead of 15? We have 18 domestic food and nutrition programs. We spend $62.5 billion, 11 of which we have no idea whether or not they're performing effectively. Well, the first question you might ask is, how in the world did we get all these programs? We got all these programs because somebody saw a need and thought they would solve that need. And they did so without the benefit of one of the number one obligations of Congress, and that's to oversight the bureaucracy. We have all these complaints by those who favor the earmarking process that if we don't earmark it, then the federal agencies will spend the money where they are. Well, they forget one little clue in terms of the power of Congress. We have absolute power to oversight every branch of the federal government in terms of their effectiveness and their efficiency, and yet we haven't done it. The Congress hadn't done it. When it's run by Republicans, it wasn't done. When it's run by Democrats, it's not done. It's not a partisan issue. It's absolute laziness on our part, because it's far easier to write a new bill that solves the same problem that 80 some other programs do and not oversight the other to see what you really need to do. And so consequently, we answer the call, the humanitarian, compassionate call to fix something, but we've done it by treating symptoms rather than the disease. We have a real disease in our country today. And the disease is a cancer that will take away our freedom. And if you look back on history, all republics have fallen. The average age of a republic is 206 years. And how did they fail? What caused them to fail? If you read the history books and look at all of them, what you find is, even though they might have been overrun by an enemy, the key factor that caused them to fail was fiscal every time. They lived beyond their means. Look at what's happening to us in the world today. The scope of our power militarily is being limited by our economic power because we are extremely far in debt. When you go to the lead economists that look at our economy, Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart, and the book that they've written, It's Different This Time, what they tell us is our debt right now, not what's coming this next year, but just right now with the interest costs that we have today, is costing us 1% of GDP. Now, we're only going to grow at about 3.5% this year, which means if we didn't have this debt, we'd be growing at 4.5%. What does that mean? That means 1 million more people would have great paying jobs this year if we didn't have this debt. So there's a clarion call out there that's coming from America, not inside Washington. Fix the real problems. Thank you. Fix the real problem. As a physician, what I know is this. If I treat symptoms of a disease and not treat the real disease, what I do is ultimately make the disease much worse. I cover up the signs and symptoms of the disease. And the disease we have is disease of not recognizing the very critical nature that you never can live without your above and beyond your means without ultimately paying a greater price. You know, the difference between the federal government and most of the state governments and every family is when you've maxed out the credit card, it's maxed. You're not going to get another credit card company to give you more. You're going to either have to start paying or you're going to default on it. The question comes is, will we honor our true commitments? Will we make the hard decisions that are required to put us on a path for renewed prosperity? Will we take real information, which I've offered 70 amendments from this over the past 6 years, which have been voted down, and will we now start paying attention? Because ultimately, if we don't make decisions today that will control and set us on a path to prosperity, we're going to be in a position where our debt holders will make our decisions for us. That's when liberty declines. That's when American exceptionalism dies. That's when our destiny is taken from our hands. It should not be that way. And so I would again call on the President to lead this nation, to define the problem, the very real threat to our freedom it is, and to come forward, pull us together, and let's solve this problem with everybody recognizing everyone is going to sacrifice, but the sacrifice will create a future benefit that will be rewarded in the lives of our children and our grandchildren. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.